mic check, please.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings.
I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
My name is John Gordon. I'll be your host.
And I'm your host, Katie Burke.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America. We bring the resource to you, the DU Podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings. Joining me again today is Jay Anglin. Jay, what's up, man?
Oh, just hanging out up here in northern Indiana, waiting for some weather to come in.
Awesome. Yeah, I like to bring Jay on, every couple of weeks, maybe every month, something like that, just to provide a little regional update on the Great Lakes region and just kind of a hunting and habitat update, because Jay handles the migration alerts for the Great Lakes region and parts of the Northeast as well this year. So he's kind of in tune to what's going on. He's talking to refuge managers and waterfowl managers throughout the region and kind of getting a feel for how everybody's doing, what the weather's looking like, what the habitat's looking like. And so, Jay always provides great insight. So, Jay, let's go ahead and kick it off. Now, like you said, you are in northern Indiana. So, let's start right there. How's your season been so far? What are you hearing out there? And, what's the habitat look like?
Well, like a lot of areas where we're in a low water cycle right now. So a lot of these marshes and these little potholes and little flooded areas are essentially dry. So, though we've had a fair amount of migration come through here, there aren't a lot of places for birds to go other than maybe large lakes and rivers. Fishing's still really good, so the lakes and rivers are generally being fished because of this warm weather trend we've had. And so a lot of birds aren't sticking around, and eventually they find some refuge somewhere, and then they become very difficult to hunt. So bottom line is, I'm not complaining. I know other guys are fairly content knowing that this is one of those years when you don't expect a ton. A lot of our spots are just simply not in play. So right now we're really focused on two things. Diver hunting, big water like Lake Michigan or some of the inland lakes. And then really the big marquee thing right now is going to be Canadas and mallards and some black ducks in, dry field settings. So the biggest thing is just got to get them to move. And so in snotty weather, you're going to do well. And on days where it's basically, an autumn day, they just don't do a whole lot. And honestly, I'm hearing that all over. I mean, birds are sitting for 2, 3, 4 days at a time and not doing a doggone thing. And if you can't be there on the day they move, then you're not pulling the trigger for sure.
Yeah, and you mentioned you guys got that early cold push, I don't know, maybe a month ago. And you mentioned that you felt like a lot of birds kind of skipped over that northern Indiana region there. Are you still feel pretty strongly about that you guys just kind of got skipped over a little bit?
Yeah, so that definitely occurred. And I'll be honest with you, I was kind of happy to see it because there's so many guys down south that look forward to openers and they just don't have a whole lot, in recent years to work with. And certainly this year, I think a lot of the birds that we sort of early November, mid-November, our prime sort of migration time, a lot of those birds just booked right past us. And some of those really high wind days we had, just ridiculous winds. So, good for them. Fortunately, the rear guard, I like to call them, and some of those probably are what I call our winter birds that winter here. They piled in about a week ago, and we were, southern Michigan, northern Indiana, parts of Illinois, and I'm sure Ohio as well, were just inundated with all these big, mallards, hardier species, like mallards, black ducks. Of course, the cans and redheads have been rolling out of some of the big migration areas. And so guys are picking up a few of those here and there when they're out hunting big water. But we were covered. And same with geese. The geese have been just incredible for like 6 weeks now. Just insane numbers of Canada geese, some specks, a few snows here and there, up here anyway. So yeah, it was pretty good. Even though a lot of them got past us, we were awarded by the fact that a lot of birds that hang out in, say northern Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Ontario, they also moved down and then they ended up on us. So it worked out fine in the big scheme of things.
Yeah, let's, and I think it was very similar to the last report that you provided, but I think the conditions are similar. But, it sounded like Michigan, let's hop north across the border of Indiana up there. Michigan waterfowl hunters had a pretty good run there for a while. And I know you mentioned that it may be going out here soon, but there's a late split. What are you hearing up north of you?
Well, the guys that have been hunting divers are just, you can't do no wrong. And in particular, longtails along Lake Huron, parts of Lake St. Clair get a few, and then Lake Michigan as well. And that goes for Wisconsin, Michigan. And then, in all honesty, the redheads are so numerous this year as, as basically was predicted. There's redheads in places. Guys are getting them out on Lake Michigan where they usually don't see them. But, Lake St. Clair was such a stronghold of redheads this year. And I haven't talked to anybody within the last 2 weeks really to get an actual number, but it was getting up in that, 500,000 plus range pretty quick, that were estimates. But, as far as Michigan goes inland, it was spotty in some areas. But most of the time, from what I was hearing from friends and seeing from guides and of course, the reports, on the migration map, is that, Michigan guys were doing pretty good. Maybe it wasn't a barn burner every day, but for the most part, it was, a quality hunt. So that's great. Good for them, because the west side of Michigan was a little rougher this year. And then it sort of came in here in the last couple of weeks and kind of came online. So they picked up the same birds we did, frankly, up here in northern Indiana, and everybody kind of got their licks in. So that's good as their season kind of rolls out and they wait for that 2-day split, in January.
Yeah. And let's roll through, some of those northern Midwest states real quick, which most of them, I believe, are closed already, or at least the northern portions. May have a couple late splits here and there, but everything that I heard out of Wisconsin from seeing some reports on the map and even the report that you provided, those guys had a pretty decent season as well, got some timely weather and were able to, scratch out some ducks and geese.
So Wisconsin's kind of funny because you have these huge migration corridors along, northeast Lake or northwest Lake Michigan down the coast. And then, of course, the Mississippi River is like the mother of all. Migration corridors. And so the guys that live in those areas, we're seeing, a fairly good amount of traffic. I suspect the complaints that I was hearing pretty regularly from some areas had a lot more to do with the weather and a lot less to do with bird numbers, because anytime there was any weather at all, you would see, wow, what a hunt, amazing, got a 4-man, yada, yada. And so I think, again, it's like down here. There's a ton of birds within 5 miles of where I'm sitting, but they're just not doing anything. So you just wait for those days, like here, we're going to have a couple next week and our season's going to be closed for ducks, but it'll be good for geese. But, Wisconsin's such a great state for waterfowl. There's so much great habitat, huge marshes, huge lakes, inland lakes, Great Lakes, huge river systems. So, if you're not at least in the fight in Wisconsin, chances are you're not probably doing a very good job of scouting, is my opinion on that.
Yeah, I think that pretty much goes for most places. That's pretty easy to say. Minnesota hunters, most of them have wrapped up, I believe. They got some pretty early cold too up there. I know the guys that I know who hunt up in northern Minnesota. They're already ice fishing, so that game's been over for a few weeks anyway. But I believe their season's out as well. So, but everything I heard early, it was a fair season. Pretty much par for the course up there. What did you hear from Minnesota?
Yeah, I would agree. Minnesota was pretty decent. And it's again, there's another incredible, state for waterfowl hunters. There's so much, latitude as far as what kind of hunting you're going to do. It's an immense state. So you can go north and hunt, basically in September, and you can come all the way to the south and hunt into November, well into November, early December, whatever for geese. But I heard a lot of decent reports. And it was, again, it's kind of spotty, but I think if I had to say one thing about Minnesota, they kind of were subjected to what happened to us here in northern Indiana. Because when we'd have those great big push days, birds in Manitoba, eastern North Dakota, they would just jet right through Minnesota and end up in Illinois or southern Wisconsin or Iowa. So that's probably one thing that I did notice. They would say, wow, I hunted all day and saw birds flying over and we didn't get anything. So that's just indicative of a really good push day. And that's what we had this year with these huge winds, over such a vast region, of the country here. You get these 40, 50 mile per hour winds, they're just going to get up and go. And that's what they did. So,
yeah, I heard that a lot too. The big winds pushing birds and, they're one day gone the next in some places. That was kind of really the only complaint I heard there in Minnesota, which is typical for some of those areas. So last week you wrote a report on Illinois. You were able to kind of glean some information, probably more in depth than some of the other states, just because it's so fresh on your mind. But the bird numbers don't seem to be a problem in Illinois right now, do they?
No, I mean, you're always going to have for lack of a better way to put it, the us versus them sort of, idea that those big corridors like the IRV, the Illinois River Valley and the Mississippi River going down into, towards St. Louis and then moving further south. Those are just incredible funnels that draw hundreds and hundreds of thousands. And at peak, I'm sure if you started, getting the adding machine out, adding it up, you're talking millions of birds here. And so if you're outside of that zone, it can be kind of tough. And thankfully for them, it was back when we had that early, big snow event here a few weeks back in northwest Indiana and southwest Michigan. A lot of the birds that were coming down went around that and kind of dumped into just all of Illinois. And yeah, there was some great reports. Guys were, wow, I can't believe it, finally. And so a lot of mallards, a lot of geese. I have heard some reports today that a lot of the canvasbacks that have been on the pools on the Mississippi all the way up through Wisconsin, they're really making a push now. And, a lot of those birds do cut over to the Atlantic flyway, or, some go down to Seminole in Georgia, some go over to the coast. And so they're filtering through. And so guys that are hunting mallards on a little pond somewhere are picking up a bull can here and there. So that's kind of cool too,
Yeah, that's a nice little surprise there. One thing that I'm kind of seeing, and really I've kind of got my eye on this right now because I am going to Indiana next week. I'm kind of keeping my eye late next week, actually, and I'm kind of seeing there's definitely some weather developing throughout that whole region. How's that going to play into pretty much everybody's hands?
It's going to be awesome. And I think for us, it's a day late and a dollar short. And then some years it isn't, some years it is. And so this year it'll be great for geese, but obviously our duck season in northern Indiana, for me, it's going to be over. That said, we do have a late split, but that's, a couple weeks away. That said, further south in Indiana, it's going to be incredible in my opinion. You're going to have birds from Indiana and Illinois. And so even some of those Lake Erie marsh, that's kind of outside that big weather event. But as it gets colder and those marshes start to freeze in Lake Erie, a lot of those birds do come back to the southwest. So I suspect you're hitting Indiana at exactly the right time.
That's what I like to hear. That's perfect. I think we're going to be chasing Canadas anyway, so probably some ducks in there too, but definitely we're going to be focusing on some Canadas. So before we get you out of here, we have not touched on Ohio, and I know have you heard anything from Ohio?
Yeah, Ohio, is kind of like a bit of a sleeper. I mean, again, it's a big state and there's a lot of different types of habitats. The larger lakes have seemed to have been pretty consistent. A lot of guys have sort of been living off buffleheads here and there because they tend to fly no matter what, and they've been down for a while. As far as the big powerhouse areas, the Lake Erie marshes are just, as always, producing well. And the open water, is loaded with divers on Lake Erie. It's some of the larger inland lakes. I think Ohio's been just a little behind on the big goose push out of Ontario. A lot of those birds are hanging in like the northern third of the state. But again, it's time where the guys down south that have been, doing the wood duck late blueing thing here and there and green wings and, bufflehead or what have you, they're going to start seeing some mallards now for sure. I mean, the bottom line is those Lake Erie marshes, they still have to feed. They can be a million birds over there. And if they can feed in a private flooded corn zone, that's all fine and good, but they're going to freeze. And so they're not going to have any food and they're going to move down. So I think Ohio's doing pretty good. I really do.
Yeah, it's good to hear. Yeah, it sounds like everyone, I didn't really hear anyone say it was the best season that I've ever had, or it is the best season I'm having right now. But I also haven't heard anybody say it's the worst either. So that's always a good kind of somewhere in the middle right there. Always good to hear from the Great Lakes region, such a strong waterfowl, hunting heritage region as well. So, Jay, before we get you out of here, we're pushing about 15 minutes here, which is perfect. I always ask you, some of our listeners may not know, Jay is a fishing guide in northern Indiana. He guides for steelhead this time of year. So how is the fishing?
It's been phenomenal, and I've missed a lot of really, really great days of waterfowl hunting. But no, it's been exceptional. And this warm weather, usually extends my season considerably. So this week I've had a couple cancellations. This silly flu and RSV going around is kind of taking people out of the game. But bottom line is it's not as good as I've seen in probably 10 years. And you know what? I'm talking about winter steelhead. Spectacular, big, gorgeous fish, and they're fun, and you let them go, and you keep catching them throughout the winter. And so, yeah, it's been awesome.
Awesome. Well, Jay, this has been great. It's been an awesome little roundup, kind of hunting, habitat, weather update for the Great Lakes region. Appreciate you joining me today and coming on and bringing this information to our audience.
It's always great to be here, folks. Enjoy yourself out there and be safe.
Thanks, Jay. I'd like to thank my guest, Jay Anglin, for coming on the DU podcast and providing us with the Great Lakes region habitat and hunting update. I'd like to thank our producer, Chris Isaac, for putting the show together and getting it out to you. And I'd like to thank you, the listener, for joining us on DU podcast and supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks. Stay tuned to the Ducks.